Welcome to the RAM Report and Placer.ai webinar. I'm Shelley Cohan, Executive Producer for the RAM Report, and today we have a fantastic guest joining us from Placer.ai, Elizabeth Lafontaine, who is the Retail Strategist and Director of Research for Placer.ai. And you know what I love about your background? It is chock full of retail, analytics, also across a variety of industries. So you and I have worked for a few of the same companies like Saks and Macy's, but you also worked at Steinmart, NPD, and you were the chief retail analyst at Ensemble IQ. So you are highly skilled in qualitative and quantitative data analytics. And I feel like you really, truly understand the art and science of retail. And I have to mention one thing, that you are a Syracuse alumni. You went to the Whitman School of Management, so high five on that one. And one fun fact that you probably don't know is you and I have the same mission, which is we want to be a voice and advocate for the retail industry at large and the retail consumer. So welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
It's hard to believe we're halfway through the year. So today we're going to talk about retail at the 2024 halfway point, insights and predictions, and what a tumultuous year we have had. We've had inflation, shrinkflation, price hikes, and the May numbers that just came out, nothing doing there, flat. And if you take into account our consumer price index of 3.3 over the last 12 months, it's been tough. It's been a tough year. So before we jump into your great insights, which our participants you are not going to want to miss because of the great data that Placer.ai collects and analyzes. But first, Elizabeth, tell us what you're doing for Placer.ai and what is your job there?
Yeah, of course. So I am relatively new to Placer, but I, as Shelley alluded to, have been in and around the retail industry for a very long time, and I'm super happy to have joined this amazing organization. So I work on our analytical research team, and essentially what I like to think of us as are sort of the data storytellers within the organization. There are four of us with decades of experience spanning a lot of different industries, but we work with senior executives at our clients on custom insights projects. We are sort of the industry experts for a lot of the industries that we cover at Placer with our clients as well as out in the public. And one of the most exciting things that we do is we work on a weekly insights briefing for executives called The Anchor, which if you haven't seen it yet, I highly recommend checking it out on our website. We publish every single Friday, so you have some great retail material to read over the weekend. So in terms of kind of my background as well, so like I said, I'm relatively new to Placer, but I have spent a lot of time in the data analytics world in retail, as well as in some buying and strategy roles, store management, things of all that nature. So retail is really my passion. I like to think of myself as a student of retail, and coming to Placer has allowed me to really look at retail through a new lens, the lens of analytics, but really from a location point of view. So that kind of leads me into who is Placer? What do we do? How do we track things? And what can we really tell you about the retail industry? So essentially at our core, we are a foot traffic analytics company powered by mobile data. So we can come up with foot traffic estimates for any type of business or physical place in the US. Basically anything you can draw a perimeter around, we can estimate that foot traffic and quantify those metrics for that location. So think about the things we're able to track like retail, shopping centers, restaurants, QSR, theme parks, museums, movie theaters, and even looking at municipalities or even cities. So how are we able to do this? So what we do is we partner with mobile application companies, and through those partnerships that we have with mobile applications, we receive anonymized and aggregated location data. And we have a panel today that stands at about 30 million devices, so just slightly shy of 10% of the US population. And with that data, we don't collect any personal identifying information or personal data. All the information that we receive is completely aggregated and anonymized. And once we have that aggregated data, what we do is we then use machine learning and AI capabilities to take our panel's visits and then create estimates and projections for full foot traffic to those locations. Our data is highly accurate, and we work with most of the major retailers here in the US, as well as a lot of the major manufacturers and CPGs in our space.
That's
So,
amazing.
oh yeah, it's
That's just
really
amazing, the amount of data points that y'all are collecting.
It really is. And I think one of the things that's most interesting is kind of what we can do with the power of that data. Even when the data is aggregated and anonymized, there are so many interesting stories that we're able to tell. There's a wealth of insights just from understanding some things like the frequency of visits, the times and dates of visits, and really kind of understanding loyalty and how many times a device is going to a location. And other things that we're able to do is combine our data with more publicly available data sources like Census Bureau, other government data sets, as well as things like credit ratings to really help provide more demographic context around our data. So we can even see at the zip code level different frequencies, and that can tell us a lot about where these devices are from and the locations that they're visiting. And really one of, I think, the kind of key competencies of our data is it allows us to do this in a way where we're able to maintain both data security and privacy, which are really of the utmost importance to us. And there's so many applications, kind of as you alluded to, Shelley, where we can see visitor journeys. So if they're visiting a retail location, where is that device going before and after? Different things looking at overlapping trade areas, either by competitors or by the retailer's same location. So we can identify areas of cannibalization. We can look at the dates and times of visits to really understand, do you have a more morning or evening shopper? All of these different things we can really help to kind of tell the retail industry what's going on in the offline world and really help them to understand the power of where their consumers are and how they are engaging with the retail industry from a foot traffic perspective.
Well, Elizabeth, I know for a fact you are going to make a large impact on our industry. So today you're going to present to us the half-year report. But before we jump into that, I just want to remind our audience that please make sure to send in your questions using the Q&A function on the webinar. We will be actually answering questions throughout the whole webinar. So don't be shy and please don't wait to the end to submit your questions. So let's talk about the industry trends.
Amazing. So as we get started today, we're going to kind of start at the top of the funnel, really what's going on in some of the segments in the overall industry and talk about sort of some of the headwinds and tailwinds of what the retail industry is facing right now. And I think that if I had to sum what you're going to hear ad nauseum throughout this presentation, it's that value is the most important factor when consumers are making retail related decisions today. And this is something that we've seen throughout 2023, but it's really carried heavily into 2024. And we've heard it in all of the earnings releases so far over the past quarter. We've seen it in the retail sales releases from this week that it's not necessarily that people aren't shopping and aren't spending. We're going to see actually a lot of traffic growth in the things that we're going to talk about today, but it's also understanding that consumers are being very discerning and very calculated when they're making those decisions. And there's definitely a difference in what we're seeing in the discretionary side of the business versus the essential side of the business. And we are beginning to see some tide shifts where consumers have been continuously strained by what's going on in the economy. And we're starting to see some of that even trickle into the more essential and discount side of the businesses as well. So to kick things off, to kind of quantify what I'm talking about when we're discussing value, what we're looking at here is kind of the food-related retail categories. And this slide is showing the year-over-year change in monthly visits for superstores, grocery stores, and discount and dollar stores. And kind of the first illuminating point when looking at this slide is that discount and dollar stores continue to be the ones pulling away share and gaining foot traffic year over year, especially throughout the first few months of 2024. And they've been the beneficiaries in a lot of these changes in consumer behavior. And we've seen this sort of trickle down from grocery stores, then moving into mass merchants, and then moving into dollar and discount, where now there's a really large pool of retailers competing for this traffic overall. And discount and dollar stores have focused on areas like improving their grocery assortment, adding fresh food offerings, and that's really, I think, paid off in dividends. But one of the things that I think we have to think about is just because we're growing foot traffic here doesn't mean that there aren't headwinds facing this particular sector. In Q2, we lost 99 cents only with their liquidation. There's been a lot of talks of hundreds of store locations closing. We've been hearing about battling shrink and consumers. I mean, you go on TikTok and you hear consumers talking about how dollar stores are now $1.50 stores. So just because we're growing traffic here doesn't necessarily mean that we're not out of the woods yet. And when we're thinking about superstores, there's been a lot of, I think, things in the news about the mass merchants and lowering prices and trying to court higher end consumers, maintain the consumers that they have. But we've also seen a lot of traffic out of warehouse clubs, which is really sustaining the growth that we're seeing overall in superstores. And then we get to grocery, and we're going to dig into this a little bit more on the next slide. But one of the things and kind of key themes here, once again, is that value is really driving the grocery space. Value grocery chains are outperforming regular grocery chains. And all of these have really benefited also from the movement of out-of-home food purchasing to in-home food purchasing. But that might change a little bit as we get into June with all of these value programs that are launching at QSR. And the other thing that we've seen is that even though we have a higher frequency of grocery visits, it doesn't necessarily mean that the basket size is growing. And that's something that we kind of need to contextualize in this conversation too. So there are indicators, I think, really that consumers are out here and making the trip, and they are trying to find the best offering for all of these essentials. They're willing to go wherever they feel like they can derive the most value from these purchases, but they are feeling that constant pressure, and these retailers are feeling it too. So we're going to dig into a little bit more about what's going on in grocery. So we're kind of looking at the same metrics here, year over year, percent change in visits on a monthly basis. But here we're comparing regular full line grocery locations to value grocery stores. And once again, it's clear that value is driving a lot of the growth in traffic, and primarily that's coming from chains like Aldi and Trader Joe's. And I suspect that this trend is likely going to continue through the end of the year as Aldi continues their expansion in the southeastern part of the US. And one of the things that I think is so interesting about grocery, and I think why they've been able to continue to grow traffic even if basket sizes aren't growing, is there's just so much choice right now. And even if you are a value grocer, specifically like an Aldi and a Trader Joe's, there's so much element in being special, where when you walk into an Aldi, you never know what you're going to see. And there's kind of that treasure hunt feel where there's different things coming in and out. And Trader Joe's, you see so much growth in their private label offerings. And so just because somebody is a value grocer doesn't necessarily mean that there can't also be specialty as well. And on the full line grocery side, what we've seen is that just because value is sort of driving the total growth right now in traffic, that there are a lot of specialty chains out there like Central Market by H-E-B and Fresh Market and Sprouts that are also continuing to perform very well. So I think for consumers right now, one of the things that we're seeing is that, yes, they want value, but they also want to feel good about that purchase. And we have consumers that are foodies. We saw it with Walmart's private label line that they launched. And so consumers are looking to get as much experience and specialty and prices and products out of these purchases too. So shifting gears just a little bit, now we're going to look at kind of the more discretionary side of the business. So we're looking at the same metrics here, but now we're looking at a variety of sort of specialty categories. And specialty has been a very challenged business ever since kind of the exiting of the pandemic. And we always enter a cycle, I feel like, where there's one specialty category that does really well. And right now, that is clearly beauty. Beauty has been on a roll, and we have seen a little bit of deceleration over the past 2 months, and we're going to dig into that a little bit later as we talk about Ulta versus some other beauty chains. But beauty has really benefited from, I think, a few things. Obviously, exiting the pandemic, a move to more experiential spend and returning to office and activities, but also kind of that small luxury piece where even as consumers feel really constrained by their wallets and their economic situation, they're always looking for that one little thing that's going to make them feel better, and beauty can always deliver that. Otherwise, I think what we're seeing is department stores, it's a lot of more of the same, but we have seen a lot of announcements and glimmers of hope, I think, over the past few months that we're going to talk about a little later, but that I think are hopefully going to set some positive momentum for the next 6 to 12 to 18 months. And then as we think about consumer electronics and home, it's definitely a different story. And I think that story really comes from post-pandemic challenges. So many of the categories and industries that had pulled forward during the pandemic of people trying to re-outfit their homes and spend money on stuff because they weren't able to spend it on experiences, we've now seen a backtracking of that. And as consumers are being really discerning about their purchases and where they're going, they're not going to replace their TV. They're not going to necessarily reinvest in their home that they just invested in a few years ago. And we're seeing that take a toll on these industries. So just to close things out kind of at this top line view, I wanted to talk about another area of discretionary that continues to be sort of a bellwether for us and sustain us during some of these times, and that's off-price. So on the left-hand side, you can see that off-price, with the exception of April, continues to grow in the high single digits. And looking at the right-hand side of the share of visits across off-price retailers, what we're seeing is growth pretty much out of every single retailer right now in terms of their traffic, specifically not just the TJXs of the world or the Rosses, but even the dd's and the City Trends. My colleague Thomas wrote about those two last week, and part of what he surmised is that these discounters are really focused on that discretionary space in categories like apparel, accessories, footwear. And for consumers that are kind of looking for that treasure hunt element and don't necessarily want to be bogged down by thinking about the essential side of their wallet, these stores are really taking advantage of that for consumers. And I think off-price has always been really strong because of the treasure hunt element. But I think right now, where consumers are looking for a little bit of an escape, they're looking for something that they don't have to spend a lot of money, but they feel like they're getting a lot of value out of the experience and the product. That's really created a winning solution in off-price that has carried them through and hopefully will kind of help them weather some of the headwinds that we're facing in the economy and with the consumer going forward.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Wow, that was a great summary of what's happening. I'm going to pause here for a second because I do have some questions for you.
Amazing.
So I'm going to start with our first question. You said basket sizes may not necessarily be growing, but with more visits and assuming the same basket sizes each visit, does that mean the expectation is that the overall revenue will continue to grow?
That is a great question. I wish that I had full visibility into the sales information of what's going on. What I can tell you is that we're seeing at Placer sort of half the piece of the puzzle. We're seeing our consumers coming into the store. We don't necessarily know how that leads to a conversion or not to get to the true sales of every single category and industry. But what I can tell you is that when you can get a consumer in the store, that's sort of winning half the battle. And then it's figuring out, do you have the right assortment? Do you have the right experience to give the consumer that reason to buy once they're in the store? So I do think that seeing traffic growth is a really good indicator because it means that people are taking the first step and they're not necessarily either eliminating that trip or pushing that trip online. Seeing offline channel growth in 2024 is so great to see as an industry, but I think we have a little bit more to do to figure out the conversion piece of it.
Yeah, I think the other piece that really factors into that basket size is the pricing, promotion, what retailers are selling it for. So here's another question. This is kind of funny in a way, not really funny, but dollar stores are a mess in terms of mergers, sell-offs. You've mentioned, some of the closings. Walmart and Target, however, keeps growing and gaining more market share. Is traffic growing in those specific segments? And how do you see warehouse clubs faring?
That is a great question. And we're going to dig into Superstores a little bit on the next slide. But I think that in terms of Walmart and Target, I think that they're doing a really good job at pivoting. They clearly have had a little bit of mixed performance so far this year, but I think that they are really laser focused on either attracting new customers to their base or retaining the customers that they have through things like price cuts and figuring out the right assortment and mix for their consumer right now. They've both talked about the discretionary side of their businesses being really challenged. So I think as they're competing with dollar and discount stores, it's about figuring out which parts of the business you need to attract consumers to right now.
Thank you. We have another question for you. This is, how did Placer get to the 30 million devices to monitor traffic? Are these random, or are they opt-in?
These are all opt-in, and it's through the kind of partnership growth that we've had with our mobile application. So they manage all of the devices, all of the opt-in and things of that nature. And then what we are able to receive on the back end is that aggregated and anonymized data.
Excellent. And before we move to the next section of the report, just a quick question on groceries. So consumers typically shop close to where they live. But I think what you're saying is Aldi, Trader Joe's are driving consumers to travel longer distances to get that perceived value of private label. How do you think this behavior will impact the grocery sector?
That's a great question, and sort of a long-term trend that we've witnessed, and Placer has been talking about this for a while, even before I joined the company, is this idea of mission-driven shopping where consumers are going to particular retailers either for a specialty or because they know that they're going to get the best price on that single category within the store. And I think that that's something that we're seeing, that as consumers are more constrained, they're being more creative. And I think that from a grocery perspective, that's not necessarily something we love because we want a consumer to come to our chain for every single thing they need. But it also, I think, gives us the opportunity as the grocery retailers to think about, what is my specialty? What can I be for my consumer so that I'm a must visit every week instead of like a maybe I visit every other week.
Excellent. So why don't you take us through the deep dive?
Yeah, sure. So up next, we're going to talk a little bit more in depth about some of kind of the themes that we had been discussing in the industry section. And I think sort of as we already discussed and kind of as what's clear is that 2024 is really a period of recalibration for the industry. And that started a lot last year, but it's definitely continued this year. And I think one of the most interesting things is that we've had so many retailers talk about new strategies so far in the first half of this year, that they've seen kind of this change in the consumer, and they're really trying to be everything to their consumer and meet them where they are right now. And that means kind of flexing with some of these strategies. And I think that some of these are really going to pay off as we look to the back half of the year and beyond into 2025. So first up, we're going to talk about superstores. And this is such an interesting space right now because we've had so many different releases this year. We have new private labels, we have price cuts, we have different ways of trying to attract consumers. And I think it's really easy to obviously focus on the mass merchant side of things because they're in a battle with grocery and discount and dollar chains. But what we're actually looking at here is from 2019 to 2024, the share of visits across kind of the 5 major chains. So Walmart, Target, Costco, Sam's Club, and BJ's. And what I think is most fascinating is if you look at the change in mix of superstores over time, it tells a pretty interesting story because what we have as of 2024 is that if you put Costco, Sam's, and BJ's together, they represent just as much share as Target does. So they have become a true powerhouse in the total superstore sector. And I think there's a few reasons for that. One, during the pandemic, we saw the migration trends moving out of urban environments into more suburban and rural environments. Obviously, that means potentially more space, but it also means probably closer proximity to a warehouse club. And they've really been able to take advantage of this and not only bringing in new customers, but keeping the customers that they have. The loyalty at these locations is really astounding. And they each sort of have their own unique spin and ways in which they are able to attract their consumers. For example, Sam's typically is getting the Saturday shopper, while Costco has more of a weekday shopper, and BJ shoppers, they're able to pull in more traffic in the morning. So they've done a really good job at finding sort of their niche. And also, once again, it comes down to value. They're really good at showcasing the value to their consumers and messaging that clearly every single day, and also providing great products and great services to their members that are really driving loyalty. So we're going to go back into beauty for just a second. And this is really looking at Ulta as sort of the behemoth that it's become across the beauty landscape in comparison to other beauty chains. And I think what's interesting is that Ulta's dominance has really continued. And so much of that is because they've been able to find this really sweet spot within the industry of being both a mass beauty brand as well as both a prestige beauty brand. And at a time when mass is growing really rapidly, some of these huge brands like e.l.f. just taking off, Ulta has really kind of squarely positioned themselves in a right place to take share and to really grow their traffic. But one of the things that Dave Kimball alluded to in April, and our data actually shows this, is they sort of saw the general cooling off of this category happen and pull up a little bit earlier than they thought. And we're definitely starting to see some of this deceleration in our data. And I'm super interested to see how June and July shake out here. And I think that this is kind of, once again, a story of value where the consumer is still really focused on that and they want those small necessities, but they're also being, once again, really discerning about their purchases. And beauty was such a beneficiary of the post-pandemic period. And I worry that we are also at a point now with the Ulta, Target, and Sephora Kohl's partnerships that there's so much saturation in the beauty space right now that the consumer, if we do lose a little bit of demand, the foot traffic might suffer across some of those partnerships as well. So I personally, and I'm sure many of you agree, I really can't believe that we are already in June and there's a lot of kids getting out of school this week. I know in California that's true, but in 2.5 weeks, we're already going to be in back to school and we're already going to be gearing up for the second half of the year. And so definitely wanted to talk about some of the categories that are really hot during back to school and kind of anticipate where we might be so far. So I think one of the things that we've seen so far this year is that there's been a general trend of kind of softening of visits, even for those growth sectors. And I think back to school is really going to be our first barometer for the second half of the year of where do we think holiday is going to land because of that? And are people willing to come out and spend? And are they going to make more frequent trips because they are going to a multitude of retailers to try to find the best deal? I think we're really going to see through traffic how this back to school season shapes up. So we kind of already talked about superstores briefly, but I think here I'm going to be really interested to see how the warehouse clubs kind of come at back to school and if they're able to, once again, kind of steal some of that share away from the mass merchants and the discount stores and sort of provide that value to their consumer there and really drive that loyalty that they have. And what I really want to focus on here is apparel and department stores. So apparel has been very challenging to predict, and apparel has had a really rough few years in terms of a lot of the vertical specialty chains that we have. But there have been some really great glimmers of hope over the past quarter, specifically Abercrombie and Fitch, which has been growing traffic and really finding their sweet spot with finding their right consumer and creating the right store environments, driving their online sales. So that's been a big one to talk about. And also the Gap turnaround that we are currently kind of witnessing and living through, both from the Old Navy perspective, as well as the Gap prestige and flagship brand. I think that seeing apparel retailers kind of regain their footing and find ways to drive consumption offline is really exciting. And I think that this back to school season is hopefully going to bring a little bit more of that. Hopefully we're going to be on trend. We're going to provide the value for consumers, but it is kind of an exciting time to watch this space in particular. And when it comes to department stores, it's always kind of a mixed bag, but I do think there's actually a lot of hope and a lot of interesting things that we're going to see in Q3. So Macy's new strategy, which we're going to talk about on the next slide, I think is starting to see some positive momentum. I feel like the conversation around that retailer in particular has shifted immensely over the past 6 months. And I think that they are doing some really interesting things with their first 50 and figuring out their total store fleet strategy. Kohl's has kind of started off the year a little bit in decline, but that has sort of shrunk as the year has gone on so far. But I'm really interested to see what happens with the Babies R Us launch in August at those 200 locations. We have seen the benefits of the Sephora partnership with Kohl's, so I'm really interested to see if we can get back to school shoppers in the door. Might they also be buying baby stuff at the same time? That might happen. And Dillard's has been kind of the bright spot in the department store performance throughout the year so far, and I'm sure that that will likely continue as we get into back to school. So talking about Macy's, when they launched the Bold New Chapter earlier this year, one of the things that is so interesting from what we can see from Placer is how some of these strategies are actually working and why some of them are actually good decisions. So what we are looking at is using our trade area information. And what we can do is look at the overlapping trade area between two locations. So we could do this with a Macy's and a Dillard's in a specific trade area, but we can also look at multiple locations of the same retailer in that area. So this is looking at the San Fernando Valley region, right outside of Los Angeles. And you have two Macy's locations that were relatively close to each other. And as a part of those 150 stores that Macy's is closing because of the Bold New Chapter, the one in Simi Valley is going to be closing down. But what you can see is that almost 50% of their trade area overlaps with that Macy's location in Thousand Oaks. So just because they're kind of closing down this underperforming other location, they're still hopefully going to be retaining a lot of that traffic and a lot of that trade area to the other location that they have open. And certainly this is not a one-to-one perfect solution. The store that remains open has to do a lot of work in sort of attracting that consumer, making sure that they're not just going to eliminate those trips altogether. But it does kind of showcase how Macy's is being strategic about the stores that they're shutting down and really investing in the stores that they're keeping open, which hopefully in the long run is going to increase traffic overall. So finally, we're going to talk about a little bit more in depth on the specialty retailers. We obviously talked about beauty, which was the one that is doing so well, but for the most part, otherwise, most of the kind of specialty industry specific retailers have been really challenged so far this year. And I see this as something that's alarming, but also an opportunity because we need specialty retailers to thrive in order for our industry to be kind of at the true pinnacle of health. These provide solutions to consumers, specifically offline solutions to consumers that are really important in their daily lives. And so I think hopefully as we get through the next 6, 12, 18 months, as discretionary income hopefully comes back for a lot of consumer spending groups, that these retailers are kind of the beneficiaries of that. But so we're looking here at Best Buy, REI, and Home Goods. And what's interesting about Home Goods is that's an off-price retailer, but it's in a category that's in decline. So we were talking about off-price before. Just because you're an off-price retailer doesn't necessarily mean that you're growing traffic over time. They're still seeing declines if it's a category that the consumer is just not interested in investing in and not interested in kind of that treasure hunt element. Best Buy and REI are kind of two prime examples of this post-pandemic kind of slump. And I say that because some of these categories like outdoor and consumer electronics, even pet, we saw so much pull forward demand there that these retailers just have not been able to keep up with that because consumers are not coming in to replace some of these items right now. And they may have abandoned some of these activities. So there's just not that same urge for the consumer to make the trip that there was maybe 2 or 3 years ago. And within the home space, there's definitely been some areas that are working, but when it comes to furnishings, as kind of evidenced by Home Goods, that's an area that continues to be very challenged.
Yeah, Elizabeth, I think what you said about back to school will kind of be an indicator for a lot of those specialty store retailers for sure as we head into that.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't mind, let's take some questions.
Yeah.
I do have a couple questions. So in this report, did you uncover or observe changes in the dimensions of quote unquote value? Is it focused mostly on price, or are there other services like self-checkout that feed into a store or chain's perceived value?
That is a really great question. And I kind of like to think of value as like a 3-prong element where you have the price, the product, and the experience. And I think one of the things right now that retailers are doing is they're using those as like levers almost. So if they're wanting to attract consumers based on price, they're decreasing the price. Potentially, if they can't decrease the price anymore, they're focusing on increasing the experience or increasing the type of products. So I think retailers, when it comes to value, it's not just how low can I go and can I, eat into my margins until they're barely there. It's figuring out, are there other ways that I can actually attract consumers that are not just being the cheapest person on the block, that can actually create some longer lasting loyalty than just a consumer coming in because I'm delivering them a good deal.
Excellent. Here's another question. How can a small company without the resources better understand the trade overlap? How could we go about optimizing our location strategy?
That is a great question. And I think that's one of the really interesting things that our data is able to kind of quantify for people is we have the most granularity within our data actually at the individual location. So if it's a smaller retailer or a regional or plays in a very specific subset with a specific demographic, we're able to really showcase like what zip codes are driving the most visits to that particular location and then look at overlapping by either competitors or a similar location in the same chain. So I think that that level of granularity is really helpful in understanding some of the key metrics around that store location and how to, and it almost serves as a guidepost of how to strategically think about improving that location going forward.
Great. I have one last quick question that just came in. Curious about the performance of e-com in this mix, specifically in home, Amazon, and Wayfair, if you have any insights.
So I can't speak to total offline, but what I can actually talk about in terms of Wayfair is they recently opened their first sort of brick and mortar location in Winnetka, Illinois. And we actually wrote about it in the Anchor 2 weeks ago, I believe. And that store had an explosive first weekend. It opened during Memorial Day weekend, and the traffic levels were truly insane. When you look at it compared to a neighboring IKEA, it had many more visits than that store sees on an average day. And the traffic was just very encouraging. And so I'm hopeful that for a brand like Wayfair or some of these online only stores that getting into the brick and mortar space will be really fruitful for them, because we have seen that even with the home category in decline and Wayfair being in primarily online retailer, that first store opening had a lot of buzz and excitement around it.
Great to hear that. Okay, let's jump into regional insights.
Okay, perfect. So this is our last section for today, and we're just going to be talking about some of the regional trends and insights in things like migration patterns and return to office, as well as some sort of regional opportunities that we can see in our data for different sectors in the retail industry. And finally, kind of finish off talking about what we expect for the back half of this year and as we get into 2025. And I think that one of the things that is so clear from what we're going to look at is that we have a consumer that has changed in so many ways. They've changed in their physical locations, they've changed metaphorically, and they're also adapting and advancing at a blistering pace. And I think that we as a retail industry, understanding how consumers are moving around the country and what their lives look like in terms of their workflow and if they're working from home, it's really eye-opening into figuring out how we need to serve our customers better. So to get things started, we are looking at some migration trends. So what we're looking at here on the left-hand side is the net migration percentage from 2020 to 2023. And then on the right-hand side, we're looking at that same net migration percent, but for just last year. So that's going to give us a little bit more context into what is happening now, where our consumer is kind of moving, what's bringing them into these different states kind of within the past year. So what I think is really interesting here on the right-hand side, looking at what happened over the past year, is that two states that had done very well in attracting consumers and population during the pandemic, Texas and Florida, have actually kind of decreased a little bit. They're not the states that are growing the most anymore. And Florida primarily is an interesting case because from 2020 to 2023, we saw basically all parts of the state growing, whether that was the West Coast, the East Coast, Central Florida. And we've actually seen a huge decrease in people coming to the West Florida. And there was a huge hurricane that happened in 2022 that may have impacted that. We're still seeing growth in the East part and Central, but we're not seeing as much kind of total growth to Florida, and it's not as fast as it was before. So the other kind of interesting region to talk about here is the mountain region. So Wyoming, Idaho, more recently Utah, parts of Colorado as well have really been a key beneficiary of migration patterns over the past year, with a lot of influx of population there. And finally, the Carolinas and Tennessee had done pretty well in terms of attracting migration during the pandemic period through 2023, but that has really just accelerated once again over the past year. And the one final thing to kind of call out here is there still is a clear and continued exodus away from states like California and New York.
Huh.
So in kind of a similar vein, what we're looking at here is kind of the same migration patterns, but we're looking at it by metro area or CBSA. So on the left-hand side, you're looking at, once again, that 3 years from 2020 to 2023. And then on the right-hand side, just over the last year. And there's a few kind of interesting stories. As I alluded to before, the drop-off of the west coast of Florida, we're still seeing growth in places like Ocala and Titusville, Melbourne, and Daytona, so more of that like central east coast of Florida, but we're not seeing the west coast quite as much. The other thing, as I mentioned, was Mountain West. So we've added Provo, Utah over the past year as one of the top CBSAs with that migration, also Boulder, Colorado, which our SVP of marketing, Ethan, had done a video on LinkedIn about this. I think it was last week, and he kind of mentioned, and I think that this is a great sort of takeaway for all of this information, is what they really dug into why Boulder was the top growing CBSA in that migration. And a lot of it had to do with just things that families are thinking about. So school district, cost of living, access to parks and the outdoors. I think these are all different decisions that people are making right now when kind of in the post-pandemic period. It's figuring out what is the right place for me and my family, and not necessarily thinking about some of the other things going on around them, but consumers making decisions for themselves where they can have the best life possible. And certainly cost of living, I think, as we see on this list, is a huge consideration for a lot of families right now. And the Carolinas, as I mentioned before, continue to drive a lot of migration in as well. So the other element of migration that Placer has been tracking really since the onset of the pandemic is return to office and looking at office recovery. We have on the left-hand side here, you're looking at our nationwide office index. So this can really tell us, compared to a baseline of 2019, where are we in terms of sort of getting back to that return to office levels. So as of May 2024, we're at about 68% returned to the office. And this percentage, if you look on the right-hand side compared to that baseline over time, we haven't really increased that much over the past few months and really over the past year. And we're kind of now at a point where a lot of companies have figured out, are they staying remote? Are they going hybrid? What does that hybrid model look like? So I think we're going to see a slow trickle over the next few years, but it's not going to be this really accelerated growth that we saw really 2 or 3 years ago. And I think the other thing to note here too is we're at a time too where the job market and companies are downsizing pretty rapidly. And a lot of that is kind of at the expense of remote workers. So we might see some shifts into more return to office if those remote work jobs are kind of disproportionately eliminated as we're kind of entering this period of economic uncertainty around the job market. So we can also look at this by city. And once again, this is kind of the same benchmark. So if you think about the national average of about 68% recovered, you can see that one of the things that's so fascinating is that cities on the eastern side of the US are recovering much faster in general than the western part of the United States. So Miami, New York, Atlanta, DC, all recovering faster than the average, which is really interesting. Miami has been a hot city for a lot of different reasons. There's so much activity going on. There's a lot of retail and restaurant outposts being built there. There's major events like Formula One races. There's just a lot coming to that city, but also seeing New York and just understanding the dynamics of them returning to office more than another major city like Chicago or Los Angeles is really interesting to see. And California has really kind of been the laggard in this. And I think part of that has to do with the industries that are based here. So if you think about San Francisco, the tech industry, there's been a lot of layoffs and a lot of kind of change in strategic direction. And in Los Angeles, where I live, there's been a lot going on with the entertainment industry over the past year with strikes and kind of regaining its footing. So this certainly might have an impact on the ability to return to office in these areas as well. And I think from a retail point of view, what all of this tells us, both migration and kind of the return to office recovery, is that you can't have a one-size-fits-all approach anymore. We have so many consumers living in so many different segments, and who might have been an urban consumer before the pandemic is now they go to work in an urban environment and now they go to the suburbs or rural area, and you have to try to satisfy both needs of that same consumer. And you might have had a consumer that lived in California and now lives in Florida, and what are the differences and nuances in their life that you need to be able to react to? So I think for I think one of the things that's so great about our data is by being able to look at things by a specific location by location basis and really rank all the locations in your chain, you can see where some of these changes are taking place and how they are impacting your business overall. So another way that we can kind of look at regionality is not just by movement in terms of consumers or population, but also by what's going on within various retail sectors. So what we are looking at here is the percentage of grocery stores as a share of visits to food retailers. So if you put discounted dollar stores, superstores, and grocery stores together, and then you see how disproportionately kind of grocery leaning those states are. So what's really interesting here is you look at the West Coast and the East Coast of the US, they're kind of disproportionately grocery heavy, where you have more visits to grocery as a part of the food retail ecosystem than you would to dollar discount or superstores. Well, that's very different than the center of the country, where we're seeing a lot more heavily leaning trends towards dollar discount as well as superstores. And this presents like a few different opportunities if we think about it, because in the center of the country, there might be more opportunity for those value grocers to expand. Winco Foods and Aldi have some presence in those states, but might be able to expand a little bit further. Or there might be local regional grocery chains that have huge opportunity for expansion there. And for the states that are very grocery leaning, does that mean that those grocers can get a little bit more lean into specialties or focus on different elements of service? And for the superstores, does that present an opportunity for them to go after some of these more grocery leaning states to really showcase the value and the assortment and the great products and private labels that they have as well? So we're going to wrap things up today. So this is really looking at kind of where we are as a total retail industry from what we track at Placer in terms of location traffic over the year. So you're looking at the year-over-year change in weekly visits, but for total retail. And I think one of the things that is clear is that we as an industry are facing a lot of recalibration. Discretionary categories are definitely struggling, but we are growing traffic for the most part. And that is a really, I think, good sign that, as we talked about before, we are getting consumers into the door, and consumers have a high frequency of returning to retail locations. And there's been a variety of performance, but overall, we have a consumer that is still really focused on the offline channel. And that's something to really celebrate. And as I think about the remainder of the year, I think it's going to look very similar to this. I think we might start to see that a little bit more of that deceleration that we saw in the beginning of Q2. I think Q3, as we mentioned before, is going to be kind of a real step in figuring out how does back to school perform and how do some of these short-term strategies that the retailers announced at the end of Q1, how are those starting to take shape, and are they actually starting to pull traffic towards those specific retailers?
Wow, Elizabeth, that's a wealth of information. I'm going to ask my audience if they have any more questions. Please get those in. We're running out of time. And I will ask you one of my questions, Elizabeth, which is any parting advice for our listeners on either how to drive more traffic, how to convert traffic, or maybe do you have any holiday tips? I know it's early, but.
That is a great question. I think it all comes down to knowing who your consumer is and kind of meeting them where they are right now. I think that that's so much of what the strategies have been put into place or really focused on. But I think what's really interesting is, as we see, consumers are coming in. We're getting a high frequency of visits in a lot of these areas, particularly in essentials. So then it becomes a question of, once that consumer gets in the door, what are you doing to message value to them? How are you continuing to be a part of their life and kind of show up for them during some of these challenging times? I think that's really important in driving loyalty, which is really kind of at an all-time low in our industry, and figuring out how to kind of move with that consumer as they go along on this journey for the next 6 to 12 months of figuring out their personal financial situation.
Well, you have been a wealth of information, and it's always insightful when we have these webinars with Placer and AI. We always learn so much. So thank you so much. I'm sure our audience really learned a lot today. So thank you, and thanks for being here. And we look forward to 2024 and beyond.
Thank you so much for having me. This was great.